now. If there's any thing that appears on your screen asking you to permit recording, please permit it, and we'll start now. So welcome all of you to the third Satadru Sen Memorial Lecture. We've had two this year, and that's largely because last year we couldn't hold it. In 2020, we had hoped that we might be able to hold the lecture in person. It didn't happen. So earlier this year, Pratap Mehta spoke, and now we have Kama Maclean who will be speaking to us, but then we'll hopefully get back onto the routine starting next year. So this lecture was instituted after the untimely passing of Satadru by his mother, Satadru Sen, who has invested a certain amount of money, which is being used to invite speakers. And Satadru, as most of you know, and was Professor of South Asian History at Queen's College, New York, at the time of his passing. Those of you who are historians also know that his work was an unremitting critique of colonial hypocrisies and calculations and colonialism's own rhetoric of progress and grace. His work on colonial prisons and punishment provided a subtler reading of Foucault in the time of post-colonial theory. And in contrast to the fly in amber variation of discourse that provided little space for native reflection or agency, and his work was in some sense at a distance from post-colonial theory. And in many senses, Satadru's work sat beside the existing historiography, commenting on it, reflecting on it, and bouncing off it in many ways. So for instance, now we have a lot of work on the Indian Ocean world that's being written. I myself am doing some work on the Indian Ocean and its knowledge systems and its geography. And most of the contemporary resonances of work on the Indian Ocean reflect on questions of freedom, on questions of intellectual affinities, imaginations, and so on. And in that sense, Satadru's work is a necessary corrective and a penumbral presence, constantly reminding us of the presence of power in all of these spaces that we see as vast open territories that are open to the movement of people, the movement of ideas, and so on. And his work showed us how colonialism managed to define the deviant as much as the primitive across the ocean through the carceral islands, through his work on Andamans, and so on. But it was not only about power and knowledge, as you know, that Satadru wrote. He wrote brilliantly on cricket, on Ranjit Singh in particular, that gentleman cricketer known for his oriental guile in contemporary journalism. He also wrote on the invention of childhood in the spaces of bourgeois domesticity in Bengal. His final work, which was written in 2015 in the shadow of Hindu fundamentalism in India, was on Binoy Sarkar, the sociologist who grappled with what it meant to be modern in the shadow of a colonial modernity in which the appeal of tradition and of authoritarian leadership and the lure of fascism had to be thought through. So his last book on Binoy Sarkar is very resonant for our times in terms of reflecting on the continuing lure of authoritarianism within societies that were once colonized. So today, before we go on to introducing our speaker, our distinguished speaker, Professor Kama Maclean, at each of the lectures, before each of the lectures, I go through Satadru's blog, which is still there online for those of you who want to read it. And this is an entry from 2013, which also shows something of Satadru's wry approach to being an academic and to academia in general. And I'll just read a bit from it before I go on to speak about Kama and her work. And Satadru wrote, "Conferences are, I find, rather lonely spaces, even Madison. The longer they last, the more depressing they become. This is no doubt due to my inability to regard my own profession with the required seriousness. But it is also because conferences bring out the eroded condition of friendship and old loves, and the fraudulent nature of collegiality, which seldom rises higher than one-upmanship, narcissism, and cliquish behavior of the sort patented by middle schoolers. In the worst cases, you find yourself doing it too. I'm always happy to leave and take a shower. And that's how I like to think of Satadru's departure, that he's present among us. He's gone to take a shower to cleanse himself of the accretions of academe, and he's with us in spirit. Karma, who is our speaker today, and the brief abstract of her talk was online, is currently the head of department of modern South Asian history at the South Asia Institute in Heidelberg. She was at the University of New South Wales and has been the editor of South Asia, one of the most important journals on South Asian history, which is published from Australia. Her first book, Pilgrimage and Power, which was on the Kumbh Mela, spoke about religion and its management under colonialism. And it's again a book that's worth returning to, considering the Kumbh Mela was probably the major contributor to the spike in deaths in India during COVID. She has been working since 2009 on anti-colonial activism in interwar India and the violence of Indians as perceived by the British colonial powers. It's the other story, as it were, that's been eclipsed by our concentration on Gandhian nonviolence. Her book, Revolutionary History of Interwar India, Image, Voice, and Text, which was written in 2016, recovered figures like Bhagat Singh from the margins of nationalist history writing. And her most recent book, British India, White Australia, published last year, an award-winning book, for which I had the honor of writing the blurb at the back. And as you know, blurb writers read the introduction and the conclusion. So I got to read the full book in its depth and range only much later when Kama sent me the book. It's an extraordinary book that thinks with the issue of Commonwealth, race, and empire, and the conjoined history of politics in India and Australia. This is not an angle that's usually taken, where people don't study, historians of colonialism don't study relations across the Commonwealth, bringing New Zealand, Australia, Canada, India into conversation. And considering that the Indians are the fastest growing group of migrants in Australia, and that migration is the condition of our times, this book is a very important intervention. So now I shall request Kama to give us her talk, and we have infinite amounts of time for questions, so long as technology permits. The other thing I would like to tell you is that there's a certain degree of powerlessness to this, because in Johannesburg today, there's been storms, severe storms. We've been having rains for the past 3 days. So at some point, if everything goes kaput, my apologies in advance, it would be an act of God rather than an act of technology. The act of technology merely delayed the beginning of this lecture. So over to you, Kama, and look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Dilip. And thank you for the introduction to talk today. In honor of Satadru, who I never met personally, but had been in contact with for some time, and his book on cricket, and in particular cricket players being racially abused in Australia, was really important in my last book. And he had also published some of his earlier work in South Asia, the journal that I edit, and we've been corresponding over that. And indeed, it was at Madison. I was at Madison when we got the news of his passing, and it was shocking to all of us, actually. And so I'm really pleased to be able to speak in his honor today. And I want to thank Mrs. Sen for facilitating this discussion. And I hope that some of the themes that I talk about will also perhaps relate to some of the themes that he also worked on in his work as well. He had an amazing way of writing, and his dry wit was second to none, I think.
Yes.
I think one of my favorite comments of his, which I just pulled off the shelf, was the acknowledgements in Migrant Races to a certain cricket club who did everything it could to make his research difficult and impossible to do by fulfilling its role as a colonial cricket club at Lord's, I think it was. And it was that kind of wry comment that I always really enjoyed in his work, aside from his very astute analysis. So now I think is the time for me to share my PowerPoint. Is that correct, Dilip?
Yes.
I think you need to give me the
share screen, yes.
Yeah.
Are you able to do that?
No, it says you've disabled it.
Actually, I did nothing of the kind, but
So can you see, there should be, can you see, can you hover your cursor over me and you see the three dots?
yes.
Pull down the three dots and there should be a make host option.
Okay, I've made you, make Maclean the meeting host.
Yeah,
I've done that.
I am the host now. Great, thank you. And so now I can share my screen.
Is that happening?
Yes, I think so. Let me see.
There we are. Great.
You can see the screen now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
It's working. So
hopefully you can see, yes, you can see my screen. So today I want to talk about, it's in some ways a departure or sorry, someone's entered the room, an extension from my, my middle book, my second book, the Revolutionary History book. And what I am trying to do is to, I guess, add another implication of revolutionary histories and some of the outcomes that came about as a result of the politics of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. And to do this, what I want to depart from is this idea that the revolutionaries failed in their actions. They failed because, you know, they killed the wrong people sometimes, or they failed because they didn't bring about an immediate revolution. But as I argue in my book, I think this is a really narrow reading of the political dynamics of the time. And what I've tried to demonstrate in this book, which I'm trying to now move to, the Revolutionary History of Interwar India, was to demonstrate how the revolutionary a contribution of random and sometimes unpredictable political violence into the dynamics of the 1928, 1930s, early 1930s period had actually provided the backdrop through which Gandhi's non-cooperation or civil disobedience movement, second round of non-cooperation, could actually be placed in some sort of depth, if that makes any sense. And I also acknowledge, of course, the importance of today, which is Gandhi's birthday, and many people may think that it's somewhat surprising to speak about Bhagat Singh on Gandhi's birthday because the two seem so fundamentally opposed. And while at one level that's of course true, at the same time, I think their politics is also indispensable to each other, in that the British are compelled to negotiate with Gandhi because they're aware that Bhagat Singh and the possibility of revolutionary violence is very much present and real danger. As Motilal Nehru himself said, do you want Gandhi or Bhagat Singh? He actually said Balraj, but he meant Bhagat Singh. Balraj was one of Bhagat Singh's aliases. And so this was the larger argument of my book. And of course, many people will be aware that the long-standing aim of the revolutionaries was to make strategic, selected, and reasonably well-planned attacks on British officials as a way of trying to answer the threat of colonial violence on the Indian body. And in particular, a lot of the revolutionaries were really activated by this idea that Gandhi's urging of non-violence put Indian nationalists in a position where they could be freely beaten by police. And this is, of course, the precise incident that leads to the first action by the HSRA, the killing of Lieutenant Saunders in Lahore, as a way of trying to avenge the death of Lala Lajpat Rai, who was beaten in a lathi charge at a protest of the Simon Commission in November of 1928. So this is everyone knows this is not particularly new, but what I want to actually focus on today is to look at the ways in which the revolutionaries also aimed much broadly, in fact, not simply at terrorizing colonial police and encouraging the British to reconsider the extremes uses of violence in particular situations. What I want to actually focus on today is, my mouse is not moving, here we go, to look at the ways in which the larger coercive network of British imperialism and the degrees to which it actually relied upon Indian manpower, the ways in which the revolutionaries tried to actually break that link by appealing to people who worked for the colonial state to cease actually doing so. So, for example, in this picture here, which is from the Chand Pansi Ankh from 1927, is again an imagining of a revolutionary being hanged in a colonial prison, in which the British collaborators in the foreground are not even deemed worthy of properly detailing or painting out. They're just these black, dark figures, the figures who are expected to be present according to the colonial prison manuals. And I'll say more about colonial prison manuals as aspirational documents in a little while. But what I want to actually focus on more is the people who were required to work in between the interface of these British colonial workers, of the functionaries, and those who actually were charged with the responsibility of interfacing between revolutionaries and the coercive network. And in particular, I will look at police, and in particular Indian police, and the ways in which Indian police responded to this. But I will also look at the prison network as well, which Satadru also wrote about, but which I think there is so much more that can be said. I'm going to start here with, this is the notice where the HSRA claims responsibility for avenging the death of Lala Lajpat Rai after they've shot and killed JP Saunders and an Indian constable as well. The Indian constable would be understood of as collateral damage. He chased the revolutionaries, and Azad yelled out, "Stop, don't chase us. We don't want to hurt our brothers. We only want to make a point here to the colonial police." And the man in question, Chanan Singh, continued to chase and was shot in the stomach and later died as well. But I want to point your attention in this particular poster, which is a little hard to read, I appreciate on especially a small screen, that the final paragraph of this proclamation here says, furthermore, it basically declares that we have, avenged Lala Lajpat Rai's death. Furthermore, everybody is humbly requested to abstain from offering any sort of assistance to our enemies, the police, in finding out our clue. Strategy that they enunciated in various revolutionary manifestos indicates that the revolutionaries had a larger plan to try to recruit select members of the police, including those in the CID, over to our side. But also they tried to recruit and target the sensibilities of people working for the Indian Army. And as we see in particular throughout the civil disobedience movement, this actually starts to really, I think, impact a lot of people who perhaps the Cambridge School would have understood as being collaborators, people who were enabling British colonial control through coercive systems, including police and prisons, but also the army. But increasingly, the Indians who are doing this work are being prevailed upon, not only by the Congress in their call for non-cooperation, but also through the revolutionaries, who make very often sophisticated appeals to encourage people to withdraw that collaboration. So here we see, again, a representation of the police as being rather demonic in nature. Similar to the last image, and I suspect they're probably from the same artist, the police themselves who are shown beating the protesters of the civil disobedience movement as nationalists climb the hill to Swarajya, the temple of Swarajya, are blacked out, and we can see that they are delineated as Rakshasas, essentially. Another image I have, which similarly relates to this, actually does show the police themselves although in this case it seems to indicate that they are British police officers. But we do know, in fact, that a lot of the police officers who were called upon to control crowds during civil disobedience were Indian themselves, and therefore highly susceptible to reconsidering the orders to throw lathis on their fellow man. And it's this particular dynamic that I want to actually look at in a little bit more detail today, that the colonial reliance on the police to maintain their monopoly of violence starts to become undermined during this period. And so what I will now do is actually focus on a couple of anecdotes. And this is a methodological necessity, because what I'm looking at here is a number of oral history interviews mainly, but also a few snippets from memoirs that reflect upon people's experiences of this period in retrospect. And I mean, there's two problems that are connected to this. One is, of course, that in retrospect, everybody wanted to remember how they were somehow connected to Bhagat Singh, because Bhagat Singh's currency as an extraordinary and arguably the foremost revolutionary is just so compelling after independence. And that's propelled by a number of things, including, of course, a number of very compelling movies, the creation and perpetuation of a vibrant visual culture of comics and bazaar literature, which tells the story of the revolutionaries' challenge to the British in particularly exciting and compelling ways. So what I would like to try and to do here is to acknowledge that I'm relying on oral history interviews, and we all acknowledge that oral history interviews as a source have their problems, but they also have their unique strengths as well. And of course, the obvious strength here is that the colonial records themselves don't have any, or don't have very much, actually. I have found a little bit, which I'll talk about later. But the colonial records themselves don't like to concede the weaknesses of the colonial state as a rule. It's fairly rare when this actually does happen. And what I do want to try to expose today is some of those weaknesses and problems. So these are somewhat anecdotal in nature, and they are relying on oral history, but again, it's a necessary evil because the colonial records themselves don't track this sort of material. And it's really only after independence that it becomes safe, actually, to talk about revolutionaries openly without breaching some sedition law, or without indeed inviting more colonial wrath upon one's head if one was to talk about the various organizations of revolutionaries. So what I will, yes.
There might be people wanting to join, and since I'm no longer the host, if you see anything, just admit them when they come in.
Okay, I've just seen, Dina Siddiqui, but I've only had one other message come up.
No, that's fine. I mean, so it's, I just wanted to give you a heads up on that. Sorry, apologies for interrupting you.
No, very good. So what I will now look at is, I'll turn to some of these, in particular, oral history anecdotes. And the first one I will start with is actually one in the courtroom. Oh, here we go. The first one is one that comes from the courtroom. And it's probably from early 1929 as the revolutionaries are being trialed in court. And I'm relying on the testimony of Durgadas Khanna, who was one of Bhagat Singh's colleagues, who was not arrested in the first sweep of arrests. He eventually was arrested at the end, I think, of 1930. But he was compelled, he talks about, even though he was absconding, to go to the courtroom every day in Lahore to listen to and watch the unfolding drama in the courtroom as the revolutionaries sang songs, delayed proceedings, shouted and interjected and interrupted the general proceedings. And as the various sorts of dramas unfurled, including former colleagues giving witness testimonies against the revolutionaries themselves. So I will now turn to this particular anecdote. Durgadas Khanna is seen by Bhagat Singh, who leans over to him at a moment when not many people are watching, apparently, and says, "What are you doing here? You leave the courtroom immediately." And then Durgadas Khanna says, "There was one Sikh deputy superintendent of police in the courtroom, who came up at the time. Probably he was not on good terms with the other officers and had overheard Bhagat Singh whispering to me. He said, well, your leader is giving you sound advice. I'm not going to take any action. I would also advise you to leave at once. Duga Daskana does leave and therefore is able to abscond for a little longer, and he ends up taking part in an attempt to shoot the governor of Punjab, Geoffrey de Montmorency, a little later on in the piece. So this is one such anecdote. Another anecdote that I want to turn to focus a little bit more on the police, and in particular on the arrest of Shiv Varma and Jaidev Kapoor in Saharanpur it's about a week after the attack on the assembly that Bhagat Singh organises in early April. And immediately after the bombings in the assembly, Bhagat Singh and B.K. Dutt, who threw the bombs into the legislative chamber, are arrested. Within a week or so, Sukhdev is arrested, and as everybody is required to give a statement, which is different to an approver's testimony, but they're all forced to give some sort of a statement. And the agreement was that the revolutionaries would give limited statements. And again, relatedly, the revolutionaries didn't always know what the full sort of plans were of all of the different revolutionary operatives. And so the information they had was always necessarily partial, precisely for this reason, to try and limit information leaking out, and to also limit any kind of damage in the event that revolutionaries were tortured, which of course they were. And so I'll now refer to this particular event where the police descend upon a hideout in Saharanpur to arrest Shiv Varma. The very interesting thing about this particular case is that Shiv Varma has a really extensive oral history testimony that is given at Teen Murti. And the account of events of his own arrest almost precisely mirror the colonial account of the arrest itself, in that, you know, there's basically the police burst in, and there are, this is a colonial weekly report here. There was a raid on Saharanpur in the 13th morning. 2 persons were arrested who gave their names as Shiv Varma and Jaidev Kapoor of Hardoi. 3 revolvers and cartridges, including empty cases of a Mauser pistol, 6 live bombshells, and 3 bombshells were recovered. And Shiv Varma talks about this in quite a lot of detail, that as the police burst in, Shiv Varma goes to his suitcase and takes out one of the bombs and threatens to detonate a bomb. And there's a scuffle, and he doesn't pull the pin on the bomb as it is. And the revolutionaries are arrested. One of them actually does manage to abscond. After the arrests are actually made, Shiv Varma is sitting down outside, and one of the arresting police officers turns to him and says, you had guns as well. Why didn't you actually, shoot us? Why didn't you even pull the plug? You could have, detonated the entire thing. And he says, well, we are out to shoot the British. We are not here to shoot our brothers. After all, what purpose would be served by shooting you? This somehow went down his throat, and the Kotwal immediately sat down on the ground. He said, we are dogs, and the dog's life does not carry any value. You are out for your country. Why did you spare us? We were only told that some cocaine smugglers were there, and we were brought under that impression. Now, even those police constables then literally began weeping. One fellow even went so far as to say, I am prepared to remove your handcuffs. If you can go out, and we shall bear the consequences. Now, this is, I think, interesting in a number of ways. In particular, I think it's interesting that the police who are part of the arresting party are misled into the arrest. So there seems to be even an apprehension on the behalf of the colonial police that if they are told we're going out to arrest revolutionaries now, then perhaps the raid would have been carried out somewhat half-heartedly. So there's this immediate sense here that the police themselves are being given false information in order to take part in this raid, but then they are also reconsidering their role and are actually quite emotionally affected by this. And again, I find Shiv Varma's general testimony is extremely believable and quite striking, actually, for this particular reason, that his testimony overlaps actually quite closely with the British one. And he's also very, very honest about the problems and the pressures that are put upon revolutionaries to provide statements, that even when you want to give a limited statement, they're particularly good at extracting the information that they actually want. And he also talks about torture in prison as well. In particular, sleep deprivation, he talks about in quite some detail. But also the sleep deprivation in the form of two ruffians standing next to him in the prison and refusing to let him lie down, and that being carried out over a number of days and nights. It gets more interesting though. Then Shiv Varma talks about how a little later on, when Shiv Varma does give his statement, this happens. The Courtroom, about who I have spoken earlier, came to my rescue. One day he quietly got a chance and came to my lockup in the night and said, "Don't give more things beyond what you have said. What you have already said will be used against you, and don't be under the illusion that they are going to leave your two comrades." He said this very frankly. He said further, "You have signed the last page. Why did you not sign every page? They will add many more things in between." So again, I find this particularly interesting because what's effectively happening here is that the Courtroom is anticipating police corruption, in that the police are going to add to the statement that Shiv Varma has given, and he is warning Varma of this particular eventuality. Now, this is actually quite important, and I've been looking at some of the records of the Delhi conspiracy case, which was the conspiracy case that was perpetuated or followed to try to, it started off as an attempt to try to investigate the attempt on the bombing of the Viceroy's train on the 23rd of December in 1929. And that was orchestrated by Yashpal and Bhagwati Charan Vora. And interestingly, it became so difficult to actually prove the larger conspiracy. And because Bhagwati Charan Vora was killed within a few months of that happening, and Yashpal continued to abscond, the case itself became sort of sidetracked with a breakaway wing of the HSRA, which again conducted a number of random attacks around Lahore, and in particular focusing on the investigators of the Lahore conspiracy case, and in particular one Indian policeman who was the chief investigator. And interestingly, there's two approvers, so revolutionaries who agreed to give statements in order for a reduced sentence, who actually retracted their statements because they were elaborated on in this very fashion that Shiv Varma was warned of. So it seems to have been a fairly routine practice. So I find it quite interesting that there's also this warning of this routine practice, that there is an attempt here to subvert the impending corruption that will go ahead. So I now want to turn to the prison system. And at the forefront, I want to acknowledge that the colonial prison system was undoubtedly brutal, and it was, I've already mentioned that there were cases of torture of revolutionaries, and these were ultimately the mechanisms that oversaw the conditions under which the revolutionaries themselves were hanged, explicitly against prison procedure, which mandates that hangings should happen in the morning, and the hangings of Bhagat Singh, Rajguru and Sukhdev happened in the evening. And it also mandates the ways in which bodies should also be disposed of, and that was also subverted as well. And that's something I've written about in the book, so I won't continue down that path. But I did just want to note that prisons are obviously, could be extremely punitive in their nature. Having said that, I want to look now at some of the ways in which Indian prison workers ameliorated the revolutionaries' experience of prison. Sorry, someone's just entered the room. I want to look at the ways in which some of the Indian prison workers in the prison system made things a little bit more bearable for the revolutionaries as they continued on their path to the gallows. And of course, not all of the revolutionaries did go to the gallows. Many of them ended up in the Andamans. Again, a note there to Satadru's work. So the important point here to note, of course, is that the revolutionaries are in prison at the same time, and I demonstrate in my book that there's a very close overlap between revolutionary and Congress politics of civil disobedience, and to look at the ways in which imprisoned Congress workers, who you can see in the background of this image here. I'm worried if I touch the mouse, this one here, you can see the Congress workers here behind bars. These are the revolutionaries who have been sentenced to life imprisonment. And these are, of course, the 3 revolutionaries who are hanged. And the additional head of Jitendra Das, who died while fasting in protest at prison conditions in 1929. So the revolutionaries and the Congress workers are in prison around about the same time. And this is where we get a lot of some of the really quite rich testimonies about experiences of revolutionaries in prison. And as I mentioned earlier, there's an element here of, everyone wants to tell a Bhagat Singh story, because by the time that the interviews are being taken, Bhagat Singh is so extremely famous and the subject of several biopics. So I'll now turn to a testimony by J.N. Sawhney, who was the editor of the Hindustan Times, who talks about, who does actually give a lengthy oral history interview, which is available online at Cambridge University, but he also wrote his own book in the 1970s, talking about various experiences, including some of his revolutionary entanglements. And I've also written about those in my book, but I haven't talked about the ways in which the Congress workers who were in prison, and in particular the A-class prisoners who had access to a much better class of food, found ways of subverting the prison system in order to secret treats to the revolutionaries. And so in particular, he writes that there was an ingenious manner in which cream was sneaked out to the revolutionaries. They loved cream and apples. The barber, who went to shave them every time they were to appear in court, had a traditional metal contained in which he made soap suds before shaving. He would fill up whipped cream in the container, which we would pass to them under the cover of soap suds. Many a time when rations were in short supply, we went on an austerity diet ourselves, only to have the pleasure of listening to their soul-stirring slogans, which told us of the joy that they felt in sharing these forbidden luxuries with us. I still treasure the fond memory of the few times they smilingly passed us, giving a nod of recognition, fettered and manacled, while being escorted to the prison van. I now want to turn to a testimony and some indications of the ways in which Indian prison employees managed to also contribute to some of the revolutionary experience in prison. We do know, for example, that a lot of the work in prisons during this period and a lot of the grunt work, prisons were, of course, inflated by prisoners who had been arrested in the Salt Satyagraha during this period, some of whom were actually recruited to become prison wardens. And in return for this, they were still required to wear prison uniform. They were still ultimately prisoners, but they seem to have been given a slightly better class of treatment themselves. However, of course, these were ultimately also nationalists who also worked to undermine prison procedure, to do things like to try to enable the meetings of B.K. Dutt and Bhagat Singh, the final meeting before they were separated. And Bhagat Singh was taken to a different prison after he had been sentenced to hang. So this, again, this is an image. Unfortunately, I don't have any details of where the image was made, although I suspect it is Lahore. It comes from Teen-Murti, but before it was archived, it was cropped. And so all of the detail, including perhaps the artist's name and the place where it was published, have been shaved off and not kept. But we can here get a fairly clear sense of the ways in which the prison warders had actually organise this final meeting of Bhagat Singh and B.K. Dutt before they pass. Jadhav Gupta in particular, who was also one of Bhagat Singh's childhood friends, talks about in his oral history interview how, and he used to also go and visit Bhagat Singh in prison as well, how the various jail employees interacted with Bhagat Singh. And he writes that, or he said that Bhagat Singh was so much loved by the rank and file of the jail administration by his charming and loving nature. They used to carry out and bring messages for him. Some of them were even ready to serve him with all of their resources. Though he was in jail, he was, as a matter of fact, almost a free person to do whatever he liked there. Khan Sahib Muhammad Akbar Khan, then the jailer of Lahore Central Jail, respected him very much. He gave all the facilities to him which he could. There's actually quite a lot written about Muhammad Akbar Khan. In particular, there was a plot by the revolutionaries, by Yashpal and Bhagwati Vohra, to try to rescue Bhagat Singh from prison as he was being transferred from the prison to the court. And Bhagat Singh sent out the order that this was not to take place, because if it did happen, then the fault would weigh on the shoulders of Muhammad Akbar Khan, and he didn't want that to happen. So that's, again, a really interesting incident of which gives us a sense of how Bhagat Singh himself became quite indebted to some of the prison workers who are ultimately overseeing his incarceration, but also working in ways to ameliorate that very experience. Again, Durga Das Khanna, who was briefly sentenced to death, although he managed to get off on appeal, talks about as he was being transferred to the waiting cell for the gallows, which he was eventually to get out of. There was a whole route inside the jail lined with jail wardens on both sides. As we proceeded, the line thus formed, it was a thrilling experience to note that every one of the wardens gave us a salute as a token of his respect for us. Even jail officials came and sympathised with us and showed their keen admiration for the bold stand we took. This is something that has remained with me as the great moment of my stay in the Borstal jail. So what I've tried to demonstrate here, and I'll just finish with this final image to remind us that, of course, prisons are ultimately places where, the revolutionaries were killed. There was an enormous amount of amelioration of the suffering of the revolutionaries by sympathetic wardens, by police who could also see and observe the corruption of police procedure around them and aim to try to subvert that. I want to sort of reflect on what this sort of implies about what I argue is a crisis of collaboration in late colonial India, that people are overtly working for the colonial state, but in fact, they're also undermining it at the same time. And much of this undermining, I suspect, is not seen or understood by the British themselves. And I think this is a really important point. In some ways, this actually relates to Pada Chatterjee's work, in particular his discussion about the secret history of Indian nationalism, whereby the Indianization of the court system actually starts to bring about a really powerful shift in colonial India. And I think this is another indication of that the collaborators who are ostensibly working for the colonial state are actually covertly undermining it from within. And I think this is actually this is where I will connect it with another project that I did on Governor Casey. So Governor Casey was the governor of Bengal from 1944 until 1946. And he was an Australian, which is why I wrote about him. And he sought very hard to try to find an Indian advisor to guide him through the extraordinary challenges of being the Bengal governor at a time when Bengal was reeling under the famine, of course. And he could not get any Indian to provide him with advice. No one wanted to be seen to be his advisor. And so what I'm talking about here is the beginning of this shift whereby Indians are declining to collaborate with the state. At first, they do it in a covert way, and then it becomes much more overt by the 1940s. And I think I will end on that point. Thank you very much, Dilip.
Thank you, Kama. And now could you restore me to my original status?
Oh, I will try. So make host. Okay, you have the.
Good. I'm the host now. You should probably exit. There we are. There we are. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kama, for that alternative history, a parallel history, another history that sits alongside the history of nationalism. And this question of beyond failure, where there is a narration of Indian nationalism, which does put Gandhi at its center. And then there are these figures who stand in opposition to a narrative of emerging non-violence, which stands in opposition to a colonial violence, which is both epistemic as well as bodily. So you have Gandhi and Subhash Chandra Bose, Gandhi and Bhagat Singh, and you also have Gandhi and Ambedkar. Right? I mean, there are all these accounts of people who become merely byways on the high road to nationalism, right? And you can see in those images where Gandhi is already standing on top of the mountain. He occupies the high ground in relation to the rest of India. One of the things that your paper brought out, or your talk brought out so beautifully, was this other affective history, where we tend to see prisons as systems of control, order, and violence. And you ask the question, what happens when prisons are staffed by the colonized themselves? And what are the relations that are built up between prisoners and their wardens? And this leads us to another question, an important question, which actually helps us to rethink these histories of violence. Because very often when we think through the Gandhian paradigm, it is non-violence, it appears, as the means of dealing with the weight of colonial violence. And we forget two things. The first, that Gandhi and Bhagat Singh probably had a lot in common in terms of fasts and so on, because Bhagat Singh was not only somebody who was committed to violence, there was also his fast in prison. And there's a larger transnational history of fasting, which has been written about. But more important, I think the revolutionaries also, to take on from Walter Benjamin, there is a critique of violence where their violence institutes another law, as it were, right? To stand aside the law of the empire, the law of the colonizer. And it's a setting up of another law which draws in these effective bonds with warders and others who see that there is an alternative that is posed in terms of the question of individual sovereignty by Bhagat Singh and the other revolutionaries. So it's a wonderful map you have laid out for us. And we could perhaps go on to questions right now. And as for those of you who joined us late, one of the suggestions that Kama had made was that perhaps you could also make this a slightly more intimate engagement where you could preface your question, if you so desire, with your own association with Satadru. Because after all, this lecture is meant for all of us, our friends, acquaintances, and interlocutors of Satadru to remember him. And so, but please make the questions pointed so that we can have a more precise and detailed engagement. So please use the reactions at the bottom of the screen to choose the hand, upraised hand, so that I can see that you would like to ask a question. Is that visible to everybody? Bottom reactions, if you go, it says raise hand, which is one of the, so do raise your hands and then I can call upon you.
Perhaps while we're waiting for that, Dilip, I can talk about, I've been searching my email. Unfortunately, I no longer have access to the email account that I had, but I'd been in a conversation with Satadru about his plan to come to Australia.
Right.
And he was planning on riding a motorbike around the Northern Territory, which I thought was a very bad idea. And I tried to warn him, but he was quite determined that this would be an amazing experience. And it would be amazing, but also be very, very difficult and very, very hot.
Yeah, he would have probably done the Thelma and Louise thing of driving or riding in a motorcycle over the Grand Canyon if he could. But there you are. Igor, you had your hand up at some point, did you, for a question? Or was that
hey, Dilip. I was just clapping Karma there, but as you've given a shout out to me, Well, as you know, I'm one of Satadru's cousins, and as you mentioned, you and Kama mentioned motorbikes. I saw. Sorry, this is a digression, but if you'll bear with me, I saw the biographical film of Oliver Sacks recently, and he loved biking across the US, and that just reminded me so much of Bapi.
Mhm.
And it's fascinating what Kama was saying about. I had heard that Bapi had intended to go to Australia, but I hadn't heard of this plan to bike across Oz. So yeah, that would have been epic.
Maybe,
Just to say, Kama, that was an amazing historical whistle stop tour, and thank you so much for bringing to the spotlight, the forelight, these revolutionaries who chose a different path from Gandhi, and yet obviously Gandhi was in that context, and the British kind of turned to him because of that context. So I thought you really brought that out magnificently. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Igor. We have two questions. First, Prashant Kidambi, and then followed by Professor Satadru Sen. Prashant, could you reveal yourself, Prashant? I mean, right now it's a blank. There you are.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Dilip and Professor Sen, as usual, for organizing this memorial lecture series. I just quickly say that, as I've said before, Satadru was one of the historians whose work had a huge influence on my own. In fact, I don't think I've written my own stuff on cricket without engaging with Satadru's work. And I often think Migrant Races ought to be read by anyone who's interested in the history of sport. It often tends to be read purely in relation to Ranji or purely in relation to colonial history. But I think it deserves to be read as a classic work of a sporting hero and placing him within his wider context. I also thoroughly enjoyed and learned much from today's lecture. And I want to start with the point at which Kama ended, which was referring to Professor Partha Chatterjee's work on the secret history of Indian nationalism, because as she was talking, that argument kept coming to mind. And I just want to think through a bit about the implications of the larger argument that she's making, especially the narrative that is presented of a secret history, as Professor Chatterjee says, and which Kama uses very effectively to show how the colonial state losing grip as more and more Indians begin to sort of cross the divide and begin to tacitly support various views of Indian nationalism. And this argument depends for its effect and power on a certain reading of how colonial power operated before, which is that it succeeded in having a degree of control and exclusion of Indians, which allows it to then exercise its power in an untrammeled way. And that's how that then unravels as those sort of the Indians who come into the system increasingly cross the line. But there is another interpretation of the way colonial power operated in the Indian context, which suggests that, right from the beginning, the imperial state and its agents needed the support of powerful Indian groups, that colonial power was constituted through an alliance from the very beginning between the British ruling elite and powerful Indian elites, and that even at the level of everyday policing, for example, Raj Chandawar famously argued that the policemen in Bombay were sort of the police establishment, and the way it functioned on the ground, was basically an alliance with powerful local power wielders, and everyday policing was conducted in this way through a sort of collaboration between powerful Indian elites on the ground and the colonial establishment. And I just wondered how one might read Kama's argument and this larger argument about the secret history of Indian nationalism in relation to the opposition that it sets itself up against, and these alternative models that we need to take into account when we try to account for colonial power and its unraveling. So it's more of an attempt to think through what the implications of how we understand colonial power from this perspective might be.
Thank you, Prashant. Kama, would you like to take up a set of questions or answer them one by one?
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Lovely question. Thank you, Prashant.
So Professor Sen, Courtroom Sen, would you like to ask your question now?
It's not actually a question. I just wanted to share a memory. When I went to school, we used to see on the board in our school a name called Bina Dash. She was, I think the incident happened in the early 1900s. She tried to shoot somebody. I believe it was the collector of the 24 Parganas, but she missed the shot. And then she was tried, but she was supposed to be hanged, but the British in the end, canceled that punishment, and she just had to serve some time. She died only recently, after several years after independence. And I remember also my father, who served as a magistrate before independence, and they had to attend. Magistrates had to attend every hanging. As a government staff, they had to witness the hanging. So I remember my father, still do remember him telling us how he used to suffer from nightmares whenever he had to witness the hanging. And long after independence, when my brother also served as an IAS officer, he had to go visit jails where Naxalites, the new terrorists, were kept. And I remember him coming home and being almost in tears, describing their condition. They were all very bright students. Some of them were even his fellow students from Presidency College. At the time, it was called college. And so generation after generation, this has happened. And I would like to also know if Professor Maclean knows anything about it, how hangings are now conducted in Bengal or in other states of India. Do government officers and magistrates still have to attend them? And has the Indian government's policy changed at all towards other terrorists? They all think they are nationalists, they're serving the people and they're serving the country, but different people look at it in different ways. But do you know, Professor Maclean, what the situation is now?
I'll just come in with a short answer to that. And I don't know what it is now, but the colonial prison manual actually mandated the presence of a padre, a Christian padre, at the hanging. And I doubt that's still there, but certainly you recall I started with the image of the hanging from Chan Fansiang, and that has the police functionaries and the colonial functionaries in the foreground, which were technically, yes, mandated to be there to witness the hanging.
Actually, those of you who are interested, there's a novel translated from the Malayalam into English by K.R. Meera called Hangwoman, which looks at this case in Calcutta where a particular individual had to be hanged. And then there's a whole story around the non-availability of a person to do the hanging. And the hangman has to then commission his daughter and so on and so forth. So these complications around hanging still persist. Professor Majumdar, Shamir Majumdar, and then we'll take the next three questions from Professor Partha Chatterjee, Pallavi Raghavan. Professor Majumdar, would you like to go ahead? First, unmute yourself. You'll have to unmute yourself first at the bottom left of your screen. There is a microphone icon.
Get me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Do go ahead.
The keynote speaker, she really gave us a very good lecture. We were really very, we just got enrichment by her illuminating lecture. I have an anecdote to say. Before that anecdote, I should mention that the police repression that went on in Lahore conspiracy case, there was a co-prisoner with Bhagat Singh named Jotin Das. He's a famous person. Jotin Das, he was very badly beaten. He was paralyzed and he went on a hunger strike, which went on for 63 days, and he died when he was being forcefully being fed by tubes. He was just 29 years old at that time. Now, this death of Jotin Das put the Bengal revolutionaries on fire. Already there was the Bengal Volunteers, which was founded by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and there was the Revolutionary Committee beforehand, and they produced lots of revolutionaries earlier. That in the Dhaka, Loman, police IG, and his associates, they were killed by Binoy, etc., etc. Now, this hanging of this death of Jotin Das, not by hanging, he died natural. He died that brutal death. Bengal revolution is on fire, and 3 district magistrates of Midnapur district in Bengal were killed, were assassinated by the revolutionaries in the span of 1.5 years. They were KD, Douglas, and another gentleman. Anyway, the revolutionary who killed Pedi, I had the occasion to meet him when I was a magistrate in Midnapur district. His name was Bimal Chandra. He was Bimal Dasgupta. His name appears in the Andaman cellular jail. He was only 18 years old when he joined this Bengal Volunteers, and he killed Pedi, the district magistrate of Midnapur, who was a tyrant. He just bet 2 boys at Hijili near Kharagpur IIT, black and blue first, and saw that they were killed later. That was that was the level of his what should I say, brutality. So he was targeted.
Thank you, Professor Majumdar. Could you just
I'm giving that anecdote and I will finish.
Thank you.
Now, that gentleman, Mr. Bimal Dasgupta, I met him, and he was then 80 years old. He still bore marks of beating on his back by the British police. So this the police brutality, I shuddered to see his back, where there were so many marks of police lashing when he was first caught. After he killed another, he was a statesman editor of Kolkata. He tried to kill him. He didn't really kill him. He couldn't really kill him. He just escaped death. Now, so my point is that this brutality of the policemen in Bengal followed the Bhagat Singh's, the Jotin Das death,
Right.
and they put the entire Bengal revolutionaries on fire. That's my point.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for that, sharing that story with us, because I think it also sits alongside the narrative that Kama is trying to provide for us, which recognizes that there may have been also affinities between certain sections of the police on the borders and the revolutionaries. So on account of their ideology, on account of nationality and a whole host of issues. So while the story of police brutality is something that is known to us, I think the other story is something that Kama is trying to present. But Kama, over to you. I don't want to put words into your mouth. Would you like to reply to Prashant's question and maybe comment, and then we could go on to the next round?
So where would I start? Let me go the other way. So with the, trying to picture where I'm starting. I think that the revolutionaries themselves justify their use of violence, and they challenge the use of terrorist, the word terrorist, because what they're trying to problematize is the way in which the British state uses violence, which is also actually in a way that creates terror. And that's precisely what they're trying to do. They're challenging the state's monopoly of violence, and they're trying to point out that the violence of the state is unfair, unjust, unpredictable, and often against the procedures of, the government's own stated, manuals and so on. I think I've seen some really interesting files on the Petty case, and Petty was known to be a particularly cruel man, and that was why he was targeted by the revolutionaries. So it is actually about, it's this dynamic of frustration that's created when power is misused and abused so wantonly. What is one to do? And in a dynamic where nonviolence is the predominant, it's the endorsed form of politics as far as the British were concerned. If you are nonviolent within certain limits, then it was acceptable. But what the revolutionaries are in fact doing is actually trying to indicate that, in fact, the introduction of violence into the system is by the British themselves, not by them. They're answering violence. They're not creating violence out of nowhere, right? So this dynamic is coming from the government themselves. And I think that's something that's really important to remember when, every now and then I get, people think that I'm justifying, political violence, and it's not justifying, it's understanding, and understanding that, oppressive states, create these forms of resistance, and it's not to be, it's not a matter of surprise. To go back to Professor Sen's point about Binadash, she tried to shoot Stanley Jackson, and I'll talk about this because Stanley Jackson was a cricketer, and so we're back at cricket again, as we must. And he had been, I think, the captain of the British team. And when she shot at him, he ducked. And he always joked afterwards that it was the best duck he ever made. So there was that story as well. But she did survive, and she's also got some very interesting oral history interviews that are in Teen Murti. Now, the Prashant's question I have, is Prashant still here?
Yes, I am here.
Could you just remind me the question in one phrase?
Hi.
Would you mind just restating your question? I'd written it down very patchily, but.
Probably Prashant, you were suggesting that
the
colonial state never really exercised that degree of control. There are a set of arguments about the raggedness of colonial power, and you mentioned Raj Chandavarkar's work with regard to the police as well. And so how does that sit alongside the narrative that you provided, Kama? Am I right?
Yes, it was trying to reconcile.
Yeah.
Yes, it was about these different models for explaining the operation of colonial power and its dissolution or its growing ineffectiveness. And it seems to me that your explanation, which I think is, I find it very persuasive, because I'm trying to think of Tilak's own, I'm working on Tilak at the moment, and his experience in Mandalay, which seems to, where, he had some helpers, but I don't think it was the kind of thing that you're talking about in the context of Bhagat Singh and so on. So there's clearly a shift. But I'm just trying to reconcile this model of this narrative, the chronology, which depends on a certain understanding of how colonial power operated at its zenith, and then how that began to increasingly infiltrated by what Professor Chatterjee is called the secret history of nationalism. How this sits alongside this other model where actually right from the beginning, this kind of colonial power it's not an externality, but it's constituted through the workings of power within Indian society, and there's an alliance. And in that sense, this sort of give and take is part, that infiltration is already there from the beginning, if you will, the implication is already there from the beginning. So it's about trying to reconcile these different models in accounting for our, the power of one's own narrative sort of line, as it were, the trajectory one is charting.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's such a good question. I think my sense is that we're talking about two different levels of interface with colonialism here. The people who I've looked at have been, I suspect, people who come from, you know, backgrounds where it's not so easy for them to give up their employment. Am I on mute?
No, I can hear you very clearly.
Oh, sorry. My sense is that the people I've written about for this particular paper come from much more precarious backgrounds. I don't think they're as well connected as the kinds of, you know, this sort of interface that Raj Chandravaka talked about. And they are required to keep up working because there's expectations of the family that they will continue to bring in money. They're working despite the larger civil disobedience movement going on. But I think there's actually, I think in continuing to work for the state, but undermining it covertly at the same time, they do in some ways actually pursue nationalist ends, and in some ways more powerfully perhaps than those who actually simply withdraw. I mean, you know, I don't think it's necessarily an either or thing, but I think it's an element of the spectrum that I think we need to acknowledge, that people are working externally for the state while actually quietly undermining it because they don't believe in its operations. They're disturbed that people are interpolating statements on statements and this sort of thing. So I think it's two different levels of collaboration we're talking about here, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Kama. We can now we move to the next round of questions. Professor Partha Chatterjee and then Pratik Pankaj. And then I'll read out Pallavi Raghavan's question. She had a question, but she's back. Oh, very good. So, Professor Chatterjee, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah. So, thank you very much, Professor Maclean, for that presentation. One of the things, well, I have sort of two lines of questions. The first is about your broader argument about you know, the political prisoners facing a certain degree of sympathy even from the various prison personnel. And my question is, do you actually have a sense that this was something that developed over time? In other words, would political prisoners in the earlier phase, let's say in the 1910s, have faced the same kind of response from their guards and so on, even the Indian ones, than the ones you see later from these people in the late 20s and early 30s? Because what that would suggest is that there is inside the colonial sort of official structures, there is a shifting, a sort of growing sense of the illegitimacy of British rule. I mean, this is really what seems to be appearing in many of these oral histories that you are suggesting from the 1930s, that you know, at moments when they feel they can say it, that various key personnel are willing to say that they don't believe British rule is legitimate anymore, and that in fact Indians should be ruling. So that's the first question I have. Is there a kind of temporal you know, history here? And the second one is about your use of all of these you know, posters and calendar art and so on, which is of course extremely interesting and important, because if you will remember from Christopher Pinney's work on these sorts of you know, the prints, the bazaar prints, Pinney makes a very interesting argument. He says that in terms of the circulation of these images, he finds that there is very little difference between the sort of number of times and the prominence with which leaders like Gandhi and Nehru or Bose are portrayed, and people like Bhagat Singh, Azad, and all of the other Bengal revolutionaries and so on. And he is actually suggesting that in this kind of circulation of popular histories, it's actually very different from the way these two sort of strands of Indian nationalism are represented in the academic histories. There's a very great difference. And my question is this, that is it the case that because you're drawn to this source, for instance, as a source where this sort of memory, in this sort of popular memory, is preserved in these kinds of circulating images, does that suggest that there is a different kind of spread of the activities of, or what you're calling the implications of the revolutionaries' work, which doesn't work like in the way in which, let's say, the Congress mobilization would have happened, which is through long periods of sustained mobilization through a whole hierarchy of leaders and so on, and sort of accumulating into large mass assemblies. Whereas in the case of many of the revolutionaries, it's these single events of striking bravery of these young men, and by the 1920s you have young women as well, and the kind of narrative impact this has on people. So which probably leads to a kind of spread, which is more lateral. It's not the kind of mobilization or vertical mobilization. It's a sort of lateral spread, and it's that, and it's very difficult to document. We just don't know how that spread occurs. But it's clear that these stories spread, and the stories acquire all of the characteristics of basically mythical history. All kinds of things that never happen get appended to these stories. So I was wondering what you might have to say about this as the implication of this the revolutionary strand of nationalist politics.
Thank you for your question. That's really really interesting. I think so. With the first part of your question, I mean, I'm focusing obviously on a very narrow slice of history here, literally a 4 or 5 year period, which does overlap with the civil disobedience movement, which has generated much more sympathy and support in general. And my sense is, if you looked at the 1910s, I mean, methodologically it becomes difficult because we don't have oral history interviews that date from that early, really. I mean, it's really something that really starts to kick in the 1930s as being something you can reliably draw on. But my sense is no, I actually do think that there is something about this.
You have memoirs and so on.
I think it's true, but written after independence?
No, I'm speaking of those who were prisoners in the tens, including the first batch of Andaman prisoners and so on.
Yeah,
I'm familiar with several, who wrote in Bangla, of course, and in their sense, the sense I get is that they don't have similar stories. They do speak, particularly the Andaman prisoners, speak one or two Irish jailers, and it's interesting that it's often Irish jailers who figure in these. One rarely, but of course we do have examples of, for instance, various people who smuggled, arms into the prison. Those kinds of various things were smuggled in and out of prison, where there must have been collaborators.
Yes, I mean, for example, the philosophy of the bomb, I saw Anand here a little earlier, was smuggled into Bhagat Singh to read before it was printed. And now that would have required someone to look the other way. So the second part of your question was about the images, and I think of Gandhian politics as being evolutionary, in that it's this long, frankly quite difficult and complex set of dynamics that Gandhi's trying to affect that does necessarily take time. Whereas revolutionary, actions are instantaneous, and they do have a much greater affect and effect, I think, as well. And I think this is what partly accounts for some of the, the redolence of revolutionary pictures that I've drawn on in much of my other work as well, because it's also exciting, and it communicates visually very vibrantly in a way that I think Gandhian politics is harder to communicate, perhaps. So I think there is, revolutionary politics is simply much more, it has a narrative to it, that Gandhian politics is more of an ideology that's much more complicated, I think. And I think given the constraints around communicating political ideology during this period, then the revolutionary idea, theatric, I think is actually a good word. Thank you, Akil. Yeah.
Thanks, Kama. I mean, and I think there's also, a way in which, when you think about the temporality of legitimacy, as Professor Chatterjee spoke about, that just as much as the salt satyagraha creates a general crisis of legitimacy, I think these individual acts of violence too, as in the larger macrosphere and in the microsphere in the prison, the kind of violence that has to be visited on the body of a revolutionary also creates a certain kind of intimacy that leads to a rethinking of questions of loyalty, obedience, and so on and so forth. And I think there's a kind an opening that you're providing here for a kind of a deeper, maybe even a psychoanalytic understanding of the relation between warders and prisoners, which probably could be a very rich source of understanding the micro-narratives of prison. As Professor Partha Chatterjee has said, the Andamans was a particular instance. It was really quite different from the prisons on the mainland. I mean, and so the Andamans had a level of brutality which is much, much higher. But here there are these continuities of the prison is porous in many senses. These are people who go out into the community. It's a bit like Raj Chandavarkar's argument about the factory floor in the neighborhood. So maybe we could think about these, but I don't want to go on for too long. We have questions from Pratik and then from Pallavi, and then after that, Oindrila in the next segment. Pratik? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, hello, hi. Thank you for the talk. I of course, I'm a student. I don't really know Professor Sen personally. But I was here for the talk because I'm in fact about to start my master's studies at Heidelberg. So I'm quite excited to study from Professor Maclean. And I think the parts about the prisoners and the prison wardens was really quite fascinating. My question, in fact, comes from sort of an earlier phase of revolutionaries. And here I'm thinking about the prison memoir of Barindra Kumar Ghosh, which he writes about his Andaman experience. And there, one thing that sort of I remember is that this insinuation where some sort of casteist remarks which he makes, where when Upendranath Banerjee kind of insinuates that he's good at the activity of rope making, he says that this kind of comparison of comparing me, the house of Ghoshes to a rope maker sort of set fire to my blood and all. So I'm sort of drawing from there. And my question is, do we see some kind of these sort of casteist attitudes in later revolutionaries also? Perhaps not Bhagat Singh himself, because he writes about problem of untouchability, Achut Samasya and all of that. But perhaps do we see it as a general trend in the HSRA or otherwise? And secondly, do we see among the prison guards and the wardens, do we see some kind of differential treatment meted out on the basis of caste to different revolutionaries and prisoners? That's my question.
Thanks.
So in response to your question, I think, Dubra Ghosh has written very well about this, in particular about how largely Bengali revolutionaries, who she focuses on, objected to their treatment because they saw themselves as being Bhadralok and they didn't feel like they should be forced to labor. And of course, a lot of the time revolutionaries are sentenced to rigorous imprisonment, which means they have to labor. And there's a lot of pushback against that. So I encourage you to read her work because she talks about it much more eloquently than I could. The question, though, of caste in the HSRA is an interesting one. And I don't have anything, I certainly don't have any prison anecdotes to talk about, other than that Bhagat Singh is also known to have developed a friendship with the sweeper in the prison. There is discussion of that, but I just can't place precisely what was said. But there was certainly a critique of caste within the HSRA. They, in their early work, they used to try to organize communal dining, what would have been a form of communal dining. But apart from that, I can't say a huge amount about caste. I don't think it's not the main topic that comes up actually in a lot of revolutionary tracts. It's predominantly class they're quite concerned about, and perhaps they're reading also an overlap between caste and class as well.
And probably also Punjab being on the frontier is a different kind of society. Caste is a much more fluid entity than in Madras presidency and Bengal presidency, where there are stricter codes of behavior, stricter hierarchies, longer hierarchies, and so on. But this is a very interesting question. Thank you, Prateek. We'll go on to Pallavi now.
Hello, Pallavi.
Hello, thank you for such a fascinating talk. You know, I'm interloping a little bit. I don't actually work, you know, on this particular decade specifically, but I just, you know, I wanted to, like, I just literally came to listen out of interest for what is really a fascinating project. And thank you for, you know, for such a great talk. And I thought I wanted to ask, ask you a little bit about, if you could talk a little bit about the internationalist imagination of Bhagat Singh and the HSRA. Was it territorialized or not? What kind of worldviews did they have? And was there like a self-conscious kind of specific critique about the nation state? I mean, were they specifically aiming for that kind of statement to be made or not in their interactions with Gandhi or other kind of figures of the Indian National Congress? Like, was part of that whole dynamic about a critique of the premise of the nation state in the first place?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So they're often viewed as being, nationalists. And they are nationalists, but they are more than nationalist, actually. They have a much larger vision than simply the attainment of a nation state. They are very internationalist in their outlook. They read widely. They read in a number of languages. They read extensively from Irish, tales from the IRA. In fact, the IRA is one of their probably most direct international influences. Socialism obviously being the second. The name, the Hindustan Republican Association comes from, or Army, depending on the context, comes from the IRA. The fasting, the hunger striking, also is inspired directly by IRA hunger striking. And they certainly start to read very widely. Mainly, they have difficulty getting access to a lot of socialist literature, communist literature, until they are in prison. And they start to get some smuggled in as well. I didn't even talk about smuggling networks in the talk, but you could have an extended discussion of that as well. But in short, yes, very internationalist in their outlook and thinking, and certainly looking beyond the nation state and to the creation of something more utopian, I think there was a sense that removing the British was the first step to a larger political project.
I mean, I guess it's interesting, because the IRA is also like a specific, it's about the criticizing the nation state, and a lot of its literature comes out of that. It's about criticizing imperialism, and a lot of its literature comes out of that. Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, interestingly, the British also respond in kind, and they also get people who had dealt with the IRA into India to try to plan and strategize their, Secret Service operations, for example. So it works both ways.
Thanks, Pallavi. Indrila, you had a question?
Hi, Dilip. Thanks, Kama, for such a great talk. It's not me who has a question. Indrajit wanted to ask this.
Hi, Kama.
Hi, Indy. How are you?
It was a wonderful presentation, and I think Amazon has got half of the profits from your talk, because I just sort of picked up the book while you were talking. My question is from a different zone. It's while you were talking about, I think, the sympathies that the jailer, there was a moment where you talked about, like, when the jailers were sympathizing, and there was a moment where they're weeping about Bhagat Singh and the other revolutionaries. So, it reminded me of Sholay and Angrezon Zamane Ka Jailer, and all that. These are people who are working for the colonial state. And so there is a sort of obviously stability which is coming from their actually being employees of the colonial state, and they are sympathizing for the enemy of the colonial state. I just wanted to know, has there been kind of studies about that among, I mean, about the what we call the comprador class, etc. enough? And B, you mentioned early in your sort of presentation that Bhagat Singh wouldn't have been able to be there unless there was the Congress, the other factor, the non-violence thing. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, in terms of one wouldn't have been there without the other. I mean, then, I mean, it's two very separate things, but I mean, just thought I'll ask, yeah, in my random way.
Thank you for the question, Indy. So regarding the comprador class, this was a real obsession with the Cambridge School of History as to, you know, how does the self-interested, you know, motives of a comprador class enable colonialism? And I don't think it's been revisited recently in any particular depth or detail. I think people got very tired of the debate in some way. So perhaps, you know, perhaps the debate can be reframed in a more interesting way. Your second question as to how do the revolutionaries and the Congress bookend each other. And so I argue in the book that the Simon Commission comes to India, Indians protest, Indian protesters are beaten by police, and then Bhagat Singh and Azad and Rajguru, you know, kill Saunders, right? And that's the sort of first moment. They then go underground and they run to Calcutta. They go underground and they go to Calcutta, where the Congress is taking part, the Calcutta Congress in December of 1928, where Motilal Nehru is putting forward the Nehru Report for endorsement as the alternative to the Simon Commission's upcoming report. And the Nehru Report has a lot of problems, actually. One, it's only asking for Dominion status. So India would be a part of the Dominions as Australia or Canada or New Zealand or South Africa at the time as well. But also it has a number of recommendations about separate electorates and Muslims, which the Muslim community are lost over. The support of the Muslim community are lost over. And the revolutionaries are there, right? I mean, apart from the fact that Subhash Chandra Bose is very prominently there at the Congress with Jawaharlal Nehru, they're part of this sort of internal bloc within Congress at the time, the India Independence League, who are trying to radicalize the Congress leadership, this sort of old guard with the idea of Purna Swaraj, let's go for complete independence, let's break the ties completely. And the organization of the Calcutta Congress is actually done largely and heavily by Bengali revolutionaries working for Subhash Chandra Bose. And this, I mean, Gandhi himself initially doesn't want to take part in the Calcutta Congress, but he sees all of these developments, including Subhash Chandra Bose in his military uniform, and is starting to worry about the militarization of Congress politics, but also the endorsement, the general endorsement in the Calcutta Congress of the assassination that's just taken place in Lahore. And I believe the next year, which simply enhances revolutionary politics even more, brings it to the forefront of the public sphere, especially through the hunger strikes, which are documented in the newspapers. You know, graphic photographs of the body of Jitendranath Dosh on the front cover of the Tribune, Lahore Tribune. You can Google it, it'll come up, it's in the book as well. These things radicalize the youth groups even more, which puts more pressure on the old guard, on Gandhi, on Motilal Nehru, on even the liberals as well. And I believe that this is where Gandhi realizes that he has to actually dive back into Congress politics to take control of the helm, which he does indirectly through Jawaharlal, incidentally, and call for civil disobedience. And I don't think civil disobedience would have happened then without the revolutionary impulse, without the fear of this, the militarization that is represented by Subhash Chandra Bose, but also the rise and the subsequent popularity of revolutionaries in 1929, which happens as they're progressively arrested, Bhagat Singh arrested in April, and then the whole thing covered in the press on a daily basis. These stories of their defiance, singing songs, calling off the court proceedings so that they can sing a song in homage to the USSR, and so on and so forth. So that's how I see the two moving together. And I see the revolutionary action, that first assassination on Saunders, which they apologized for, which they expressed regret for, as being a necessary attempt to try and get British attention, because the British are not giving attention to the politics of nonviolence. They're not compelled to. Whereas the threat of, so what happens when when a British policeman is gunned down in Lahore, what happens? Enormous amounts of pressure from the British expatriate community throughout India, actually, on the British to do something. You can't just let this happen. This is chaos. What are you doing to stop this? Now, this pressure also becomes present less so, I think, in London, where they seem to be a bit disconnected from the realities of what it's like to be a Briton in India, which is becoming increasingly more difficult and uncomfortable. And these, random attacks, seemingly random attacks, just put more anxiety in the British residents of India at the time, who are supposed to be this backbone, right, of Indian colonialism. So I see these, I see the revolutionaries as actually instigating and propelling the larger movements of the Congress and the civil disobedience movement. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Satadru Sen, Ma, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, I just wanted to address something that Pratik raised, the question about caste. And I believe in Satadru's book, Disciplining Punishment, where he largely addresses the Andaman Islands prisons, he does mention that elaborate arrangements were made by the British to, post Brahmins in the kitchen as cooks so that no castes would object. So maybe he can find some answers there. But with the arrival of women in the jail, the caste system by and large began to break down, because men and women would marry from different castes there in the Andaman prisons.
Oh, thank you.
That's all.
Thank you. Interesting observations there. Are there any more questions? Doesn't seem to be. May I just take up this question again of the alternative moral vision that the revolutionaries offer, Bhagat Singh and others, as opposed to Gandhi, and both help to undermine the legitimacy, as it were, of British Empire at the macro and the micro level. And that's an important question that lies at the heart of your presentation. And, and this comes up and what happens subsequently is an interesting question as well, because we tend to look at this as a world that doesn't intersect with the real world. Prisoners leave the prison, the warders leave the prison, they meet up later, right, in real life. And,
yes.
and what is the story there? Because you have, for example, Ariel Dorfman's Death and the Maiden, the play that deals with this. There's Liliana Cavani's film starring Dirk Bogarde and Charlotte Rampling, which looks at the interrogator and the women in a Nazi prison and so on. I mean, the multiple ways in which fiction has tried to address this question. There's one very poignant instance narrated by Anke Krog, who was a poet who reported on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in her book, Country of the Skull, she speaks about a prisoner who was subjected to brutal torture by this policeman. And then, of course, apartheid comes to an end and everybody goes back to their lives. And the man who was tortured continues to bear the marks of that torture. He still is unable to relate to his family. He is still burdened by the memory of the horror that's been visited on him. And one day on the road, he meets his former interrogator. And the interrogator is now an impoverished man on the road, no longer possessed of the power that he had in that microclimate. And the former prisoner then invites him home to give him food because he is so overcome by the abjectness of his former interrogator, and his wife can't understand the sympathy that this man bears towards somebody who destroyed his life. But I think these are the kinds of instances that are sometimes get lost in our larger narratives, which are about power and abjection, and not about these complicities, effective relations which are built up. I mean, that was just something that came to my mind. And I think you've opened up a whole new terrain of study here, which we need to look at more seriously.
That's really generous of you, but I agree. I think, I found a couple of references in oral history interviews where revolutionaries do meet up with their targets in particular, right? People who they tried to kill and didn't. Right. And they're remarkably they're human. There's not a why did you, there's no I'm struck actually by how extraordinary some of these encounters are, and I'm just trying to think who it is. I think it's Hodson, but it might be Montmorency. So both Hodson and Montmorency were targeted by revolutionaries, and I have a feeling both of them met their would-be assassins after independence, and they had a discussion about it, and it seems to have been, quite interesting. I think it was actually also the Basil Blackett's wife. So one of the revolutionaries throws a, separate incident, throws a suitcase at Basil Blackett in the Legislative Assembly. And he goes and meets his wife afterwards, and they have this perfectly civil discussion about what would I have done if my husband had been killed by your flying suitcase? And the revolutionary says, well, I'll marry you. And they have this, this bizarre exchange. So, sometimes it's not all personalized. Again, I have another interesting Bhagat Singh anecdote and this one comes from Jadev Gupta, who was Bhagat Singh's friend, was not a revolutionary himself. And he said that women used to come, British women used to come and see him in the prison because they'd heard so much about him. He was this famous figure and spoken about extensively in the press, and they would go and meet him, and he would stand up and meet them like he was welcoming a friend. And Gupta says, you have to understand his personality. He was extraordinarily generous. And he said, when a representative of the state came, obviously that was different, but he had an extreme, he had warmth and an extraordinary human kind of connection with people that Jadev Gupta was always very, struck by. Yeah.
Thank you, Kama. I mean, and if there are any more questions, they don't appear to be, but thank you for a fascinating lecture and for opening up an entirely new perspective, I thought, a micro perspective on the macro narratives of nationalism, looking at the prison differently, looking at the discourses on revolutionary movement differently. And I wish Satadru were here to make some dry remarks about the talk itself, but thank you all, and thank you, Professor Satadru Sen, for instituting the lecture and making this possible so that Kama can speak to us about her ongoing work. Thank you to all of you who stayed the course and been with us from the beginning till the end of the lecture. I think what we'll do now is I'll end the recording, and I shall put up the recording on YouTube in a few days, and I shall post it on Facebook. and hopefully there shall be ripples where somebody will inform others and so on, because I'm not sure what exactly the YouTube link will be right now. But thank you all. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Kama. Look forward to your new book.
Thank you. There's a new book?
Yes, there is. We insist.
Oh, I'll try. Thank you very much. And thank you for all my friends who came up. It's really